What is going on, people? Today we're going to be talking about wedges and specifically how to go ahead and attack wedges if you're rallying them, because of course you guys know that phalanxes, they're fairly simple to understand. Infantry phalanx, obviously you want to hit with cavalry first. Range phalanx, you hit with infantry. Cavalry phalanx, you hit with range. Those are very straightforward because the front line is very straightforward. And then once you get rid of the front line, then obviously you know exactly how to hit it after that. But with wedges, it does present a little bit of a different challenge because the front line isn't as clear. But that's what we're going to go ahead and talk about today. I will say, though, with a bit of a disclaimer, there is no specific way to hit every sort of formation because the formation is also dependent on the comp of what you're attacking. And I will get into that in just a bit to clear that up. But before that, a word from our sponsor. At Boost Gaming, you can purchase all of your wallet top-ups for PlayStation, Xbox, Nintendo, and Spotify. You can support me by heading over and purchasing using the link in the description below. Whatever it is you're looking for and you're needing, you name it, they got it. Like I mentioned, check out the link in the description and make sure you tell them I sent you. Now let's go ahead and get started first with Infantry Wedge. Now, if you look at infantry phalanx, like we mentioned before, obviously you want to hit it with calves first and then range from there on, etc., etc. But with infantry wedge, it's a bit of a mystery because you have two infantry squads that are going to be your front line, and then you kind of have a mismatch of infantry and ranged, kind of like together here. But first of all, there's one thing that you have to keep in mind when you're looking at this army lineups and infantry wedge. Number one is that when the battle starts, these still images are going to be moving, and specifically they're going to be moving up. Now ranged is always going to be the wild card because ranged does move up, but they do stay at range, hence their name, and you have to account for that. So here's how you want to attack infantry wedge. Okay, first of all, you want to attack the first two squads, which is infantry. So you'd want to go cavalry. Now, most people would be worried that after the infantry, they're going to have to attack the ranged. But that's actually not the case, because what ends up happening here is that by the time you get rid of these two infantry squads, these next two infantry squads will be moving up in front of the ranged. And then the cavalry will then also be moving up in front of the range as well. For you to actually hit range in an infantry wedge, you would have to literally get through the infantry squads in a matter of seconds. So if they have little to no infantry, then at that point you definitely don't want to go calves because you won't be hitting the calves either. You will run into the ranged. But if they have a decent amount of infantry to where you're not going to just absolutely destroy the infantry in a matter of seconds, and it gives it enough time for the cavalry to run past the ranged, then you absolutely want to go cavalry. Now, if their infantry numbers are low, meaning that you're going to wipe out the infantry numbers rather quickly, then what I would suggest you do is you go ranged, because there's not going to be enough infantry to hurt you. And then if you don't take out the infantry too quickly, that actually may be best case scenario for you, because then you're going to attack the cavalry. Worst case scenario, by the time you get rid of the small amount of infantry, then you're just going to be attacking the ranged. So those are two of the little caveats that you have. Definitely go cavalry if the infantry numbers are large. If the infantry numbers are rather low, then I would suggest going ranged. Now, of course, like I mentioned, the composition that you're attacking is going to determine all of that. But the main thing to note here is where the range is going to be by the time you can get to them. If you can get to them fast enough to where you're going to actually be able to hurt them, then you definitely don't want to go infantry, because you're never going to get past the infantry and the calves before you even get to the range. So something to keep in mind. Now let me go ahead and show you exactly what I mean. Now in the left hand side, I'm on an infantry wedge, and on the right hand side, it's just an infantry phalanx. Let's just say that what we're really focused on more is the cavalry on the right hand side. So the rest, don't worry about it. Just look at what the cavalry do. And I want you to see what happens with the ranged on the left hand side, how they stay back, and then the rest of the armies goes in front of them. So that's something that you have to take into account. So let's go ahead and play it. So take a look at this. The range is moving on up. Now they stop, and then the rest of your armies is already moving up. So this is why I'm telling you, if their infantry numbers are very, very low, which they'll literally have to be next to none, you want to make sure that you account for the range sitting all the way in the back. And in an infantry wedge, I really wouldn't count on hitting the ranged unless you're just literally hitting no infantry at all, because that's what's going to happen. You're going to have to go through their whole army before you can even touch the range. So as long as you keep that in mind, you should be good to go. Now we get into ranged wedge. Now this is actually one of people's favorites to defend on, and we're going to touch on that for in a minute. But range wedge is also very, very interesting, and if you really see all the wedges, the thing that they're trying to do is, if you have a front line in a wedge, they try to make sure that whatever counters your front line, you have an answer to right next to it. So it's very, very hard to take down. Now with a range wedge, it's interesting because you have a range front line of 2. But remember that range is going to sit back, and then the rest of the army is going to be moving up. So what a lot of people like to do in against a range wedge is actually going full ranged. Now the reason for that is because, number one, infantry is all the way in the back. So by the time their infantry, which is all the way in the back, reaches your range, which is going to be as far back as you can have it, that's going to be like almost half the battle. So before they can actually counter what you're sending, they're going to have to walk all that way. The other reason is, if you go ranged on range, all you have to do is wipe out 2 of these ranged squads, their front lines, and then after you do that, you're going to be hitting their cavalry, which is exactly what you want. Ranged on cavalry is the worst matchup if yours is the cavalry you could have, just because cavalry is going to be fighting by themselves most of the time because they're so fast. And then range can attack them before the cavalry can attack them. So that's something that you really, really want to keep in mind. The only caveat to this is if their range numbers are very, very high, meaning that you might send a full range rally and you may not take down 2 of their squads just because their range numbers are so high, then you will probably be best going with infantry just to make sure you do as much damage as you can. Just know that if you hit a ranged wedge with infantry, even though you are going to be dealing a ton of damage to these 2 squads, their cavalry is going to take your infantry out fairly quickly, unless their cavalry isn't like a very big number or something like that. But if they have like 2 million T4, 4 million T2 cavalry, etc., your infantry rally is going to get wiped out fairly fast. But what you're banking on is to do enough damage to the ranged 2 squads in the front to be worth it. But if their numbers are not too crazy, I would absolutely recommend going ranged against a range wedge, just because the infantry is going to take forever to get there. But let's go ahead and see it in action. Okay, now on the left hand side I have range wedge. On the right hand side I have cavalry, which is going to have the infantry in the back. Okay, now I want you to take a look and see how long it takes for the infantry to even get there. Now the main things that we're going to be focusing here on the left hand side is just the range, and on the right hand side the infantry. The infantry will get stopped just because this is mix on mix and I can't really edit it any other way. I really wish you could, but unfortunately we can't. But I want you just to see how slow the infantry walks. So just imagine if they had to go the whole way into the range, how long this is going to take. So let's take a look. So the range is going to go up, it's going to stop, and then take a look at the infantry, which is the troops that are all the way in the back, okay? They're still moving on up. They still haven't joined the battle, and they just got there. That was a good like 15 seconds of infantry doing absolutely nothing to your range. whereas your range would have been attacking their range, their cavalry, etc. So like I mentioned before, their composition is definitely what you need to take into account first before you attack a wedge, because their numbers, etc., is going to actually factor into your decision. But for sure, if the numbers aren't too crazy, I would go ranged. If their range numbers are very, very high, I would go infantry. But I will just tell you, the chances of you getting capped would be higher just because the cavalry will destroy you. And now we get to Cavalry Wedge. I feel like this is probably the easiest one, just because ranged is all the way in the back already. And what you're going to have is cavalry front line with infantry at the same time. Now, there's two different ways to approach this, but honestly, in a cavalry wedge, if all the troops are somewhat equal and one isn't like way more than the other, etc., I would absolutely hit a cavalry wedge with straight cavalry. The reason I would do that is because you're going up against cavalry on cavalry, and yours should be able to win that because it's going to be 4 squads against their initial 2. And then what's going to happen is yours is going to break down into hitting cavalry and inf, which is exactly what you want, because you want your cavalry to hit their infantry. Since their range is going to be all the way in the back, you definitely never want to send infantry unless their whole army is pretty much already wiped out. So infantry is out the window here. And if their cavalry numbers are somewhat low, then you absolutely want to hit cavalry, because then you're going to be fighting mostly infantry. Now, if their infantry numbers are a bit lower and their cavalry numbers are a bit higher, then you do want to hit with range. And this is why I keep saying their composition when it comes to a wedge, a lot of times is what determines what you hit with, because with a phalanx, range phalanx, infantry phalanx, it's very, very simple. Take out their front line and then counter them from there. But with a wedge, a lot of times it depends on how many troops they have and how long it's going to take for you to take out these 2 initial squads. So those are the main things you need to keep in mind. So number 1, first of all, is always keep in mind that ranged is going to behave a little bit differently than the other ones, because they will stop. As soon as they have you in their range, they will stop and just attack you from there, and everybody else is going to move in front of them. So you always have to account for that. And the other thing is, make sure that you check what their composition is, the numbers, etc., because that can sway how you hit a wedge. Outside of that, like I mentioned before, if you know exactly what kind of rally is coming at you, then a phalanx is definitely the best to defend with. But for instance, if you are offline, sit in a wedge. Just please no cavalry phalanx or wedge ever, because just don't. Never sit in any of these unless you know for a fact an infantry rally is coming at you, because cavalry is way too fast for their own good, and that can be picked apart. But regardless of all of that, if you're going to be offline, always sit in either an infantry wedge or a range wedge, because they are going to be much harder to pick apart. Because if you sit in a phalanx, they're just going to destroy your front line, and then from there, you're easy picking. So hopefully you guys learned something new. If you didn't, and I missed something, make sure that you leave it down in the comment section and we can talk about it. But appreciate you guys for watching, and until later, bye.